This is the tutorial for ionic compounds with polyatomic ions. So here are the rules when you're trying to write the chemical formula from the name. It is very similar to when you are trying to write a binary ionic compound. So for example, here is potassium permanganate. All you have to do is look up potassium and the charge on potassium, and you look up the charge on permanganate, and then you would do the crisscross rule, and you end up with KMNO4. Well, what if you have one that is a transition metal, copper 2 sulfate? Okay, so now we already know the charge on copper 2, and now you have to just look up sulfate and know the charge between them and do the crisscross rule, and we'll do a couple examples later, and you end up with CuSO4. Now, if you have more than one polyatomic ion when you do the crisscross rule, you have to make sure that you write the polyatomic ion in parentheses. So if we look at cobalt nitrate, when we write this, you're going to end up having 2 nitrate ions when you do the crisscross rule. So what you do is you encompass the whole entire polyatomic ion in parentheses, and then outside of the parentheses you would write the number of ions in the compound. Now if you were given the chemical formula, when you write the chemical name, it's very simple. It's like when you do the binary ionic compounds, except you're not going to change the name of your ion. It's whatever you memorized. So it's just chemical name equals the name of the metal and the name of the polyatomic ion. So when we look at this, again, like when we were doing the binary, you have to see whether or not the metal that's given to you is part of the S block or a transition metal. This is part of the transition metal. So we have to determine the charge in order for us to write the name. So if we look up hydroxide, we should know hydroxide has an overall charge of -1, and there's only one of them, so our anion has an overall -1 charge. Copper, on the other hand, the cation has to have an overall charge of +1. But there's only one copper, so that means this has to have a +1 charge. When we write the name, it's going to be copper 1 hydroxide. Here's a second example. Let's go ahead and look at cobalt. Again, cobalt is a transition metal, so we have to go ahead and figure out the charge of cobalt by looking at NO3. NO3 has an overall charge of -1, and there's 2 NO3s, so that means that we have to have an overall charge of -2. The cation has to have an overall charge of +2. There is only one cobalt, so the charge on the one cobalt should be +2. Therefore, when we write this, you have to have cobalt 2 and the name of your polyatomic ion, nitrate. Now go ahead and practice this on your own. If you have questions, go watch the tutorials again and then try your best to answer this part. Once you are done, go ahead and check the answer key. I will unpause it and play the video for a little longer, and I will have the answer key. Now that you've practiced writing the name, let's go ahead and practice writing the chemical formula from the name. So let's go ahead and practice with our first example for iron 2 chlorate. And so I'm going to go ahead and write iron +2 for the 2 chlorate. And then chlorate is ClO3, and because it has an overall charge of -1, I'm going to go ahead and put the parentheses. Then I'm going to go take and do the crisscross rule. Okay, this time instead of writing the the +2 right here inside the ClO3, it's outside of the parentheses. So when I write my chemical formula, it should end up looking like Fe and in parentheses, ClO3, outside the parentheses, 2. Here's our second example, chromium 3 sulfate. Let's go ahead and write our next example, chromium 3 sulfate. So here's chromium and it has a +3. Sulfate has an overall charge of -2. And when we do the crisscross rule, we should end up with Cr2SO4 3. And just as a friendly reminder, if I had only had one sulfate, not 3, I don't have to have these parentheses around the polyatomic ion. You only have parentheses when there is more than one present. So go ahead and try doing the rest of the problems. If you still have problems on how to do this, watch the tutorial again and check your answers when you're done. Go ahead and pause here and press play when you're ready to check the answer key. If you have any other questions, feel free to ask in class. When you are done with this, you may go ahead and do the worksheet and the practice quiz in order to learn make sure that you understand how to do names for ionic compounds.